Silas Mercer was 68 when the first neighbor told him to destroy the field. The sweet clover had only been visible for 3 weeks. From the county road, it looked harmless. A young green stand covering 42 acres of ground that had frustrated Silas for most of the last decade. The field sat on the western edge of his ranch where the soil turned pale and hard by midsummer. Alfalfa had struggled there twice. One grass seeding had failed almost completely. Sweet clover had not. By late May, it stood nearly knee-high in the better sections. That was when Roy Bennett stopped his pickup beside the fence. He climbed out slowly and stared across the field. "What did you plant?" Silas kept tightening the wire on a corner post. "Clover." Roy looked again. "That sweet clover?" "Yes." Roy's expression changed. Not surprise. "Concern. You feeding cattle off that?" "Not right now." "You planning to?" Silas pulled the wire tight. Eventually, Roy stepped closer. "My dad used to call that bleeding hay." Silas knew the name. Everyone his age did. Decades earlier, cattle in the county had developed unexplained bleeding after being fed spoiled sweet clover hay. Some bled from the nose. Some developed large swellings beneath the skin. A few died. The story survived longer than most of the farms involved. The details did not. By the time Silas was a boy, the lesson had become simple. Sweet clover killed cattle. Do not grow it. Do not bale it. Do not feed it. Roy pointed toward the field. "You know what that stuff can do." Silas nodded. "I do." "Then why plant 40 acres of it?" Silas looked across the clover. "Because knowing something can go wrong isn't the same as knowing why." Roy laughed once. "You planning to argue with dead cows?" "No." Silas pushed the fencing pliers into his back pocket. "I'm planning not to make the same hay." Roy stared at him. "What does that mean?" Silas did not answer. Not because he wanted to sound mysterious, because the answer was more complicated than one conversation beside a fence, and because part of him still wasn't certain he could pull it off. The idea had begun that winter in the attic of the old farmhouse. Silas had been looking for tax records when he found a wooden box marked with his father's initials. Inside were weather notes, seed receipts, livestock records, and 3 narrow notebooks from the 1950s. His father, Walter Mercer, had experimented with sweet clover before Silas was born. Silas knew that much. What he had never known was why Walter stopped. Not because the crop failed. The notebook suggested the opposite. One entry read, "Westfield, good stand. Dry year, held better than expected." Another, "Cut too heavy before rain. Mow stayed wet." Then, several pages later, "Never blame the field for what happened in the mow." Silas had read that sentence at least 20 times. It contradicted the story he had heard his entire life. The danger had not started where the clover grew. Something happened after it was cut. That distinction was why 42 acres were now green. Roy shook his head. "If you asked me, I'd plow it under before somebody's cattle gets into it. My cattle aren't in it. Yet." Silas looked at him. "Growing it is the easy part." Roy frowned. "What's the hard part?" Silas looked toward the field again. The clover moved lightly in the wind. Healthy, green, completely ordinary. "The hard part starts when I cut it." Roy left without answering. By June, other people had noticed. At the feed store, someone asked Silas whether the rumors were true. At church, an old rancher told him his father had known a man who lost 4 cows to sweet clover hay. Silas listened to every story. He did not tell anyone they were wrong. That was important. The cattle had bled. The danger had been real. The mistake was believing the plant became dangerous simply by existing in a field. That evening, Silas walked the western acreage alone. The stand was thick enough now that he could imagine the windrows after cutting. He bent and rubbed a stem between his fingers, then looked toward the western sky. Harvest was still weeks away, and harvest was where the experiment would stop being theoretical. If Silas was right, the field everyone feared could become useful forage. If he was wrong, no neighbor in the county would ever forget it. He opened his father's notebook one more time. At the bottom of the page, beneath the sentence about the mow, Walter had added 3 words. "Watch the moisture." Silas first heard the story when he was 9. His father told it after supper one winter evening while snow pressed against the kitchen windows. A rancher named Howard Crane had put up sweet clover hay after several days of bad weather. The hay had gone into the barn damp. Vague slaughter. Cattle began bleeding. One cow developed a swelling along the shoulder. Another bled from the nose. 2 died before anyone understood what was happening. By spring, nobody in the county wanted anything to do with sweet clover. Silas remembered the way his father told the story. Not dramatically, almost clinically, but the conclusion spread differently once it passed from one rancher to another. The hay killed cattle. Then, sweet clover killed cattle. Then eventually, that plant is poison. By the time Silas was old enough to manage pasture on his own, the argument was already over. You planted alfalfa, grass, maybe a different legume, if conditions suited it. You did not plant sweet clover on purpose. Silas never questioned that. In fact, when he was 24, his father suggested putting sweet clover back into the western field. Silas laughed. You want to kill the herd? Walter Mercer looked at him across the tractor hood. No. Then why grow it? Because that ground holds it better than alfalfa. Silas shook his head. Everybody knows what sweet clover does. Walter wiped grease from his hands. Everybody remembers what happened. That's the same thing. No. Silas still remembered the pause that followed. Then Walter said, they remembered the cattle. They forgot the hay. At 24, Silas thought that sounded like an old man defending an old mistake. He planted alfalfa instead. The stand lasted 3 seasons. Then weakened. He reseeded. It failed again. Years passed. Walter died. The western field stayed difficult. Silas tried grass. Then another alfalfa mix. Then left part of it mostly unused. The story about poison never left. Neither did Walter's sentence. They remembered the cattle. They forgot the hay. Now, at 68, Silas finally understood why the wording bothered him. Walter had separated 2 things. Everyone else had merged into one. The plant, and what happened after cutting. Silas spent evenings comparing his father's notebooks. There were no veterinary explanations, no chemical names, no scientific language. Walter wrote like a farmer. Cut clean. Rain. Second day. Windrows stayed heavy. Barn stack heated. Do not feed. Another page. Dry cure. Good color. Fed with grass hay. No trouble. Silas stared at those entries. The difference was not the field. It was the condition of the hay. That did not make sweet clover harmless. It made the danger more specific. And specific danger could be managed better than superstition. The next morning, Silas drove into town and found Roy Bennett at the feed store. Roy was drinking coffee beside the counter. You still growing your poison field? Yes. Roy grinned. Silas placed one of Walter's old notebooks on the counter. Roy looked at it. What's that? The part of the story nobody remembers. Silas opened to the page about the wet hay. Roy read silently, then looked up. So your father fed it? Sometimes. And cattle didn't die? Not every time. Roy frowned. Silas pointed to the other entry. Look at what changed. Roy read again. Red high. Heating. Spoilage. Do not feed. Dry cure. No trouble. The grin disappeared. You saying all those old stories were wrong? No. Silas closed the notebook. I'm saying they were incomplete. That answer mattered. Silas was not trying to prove the county foolish. He was trying to recover the missing half of a warning. The cattle really had died. The hay really could become dangerous. But fear had flattened the lesson until only one rule remained. Never grow the crop. Silas was beginning to believe Walter had known a better rule. Grow it only if you understand what comes after. That afternoon, Silas walked the western field again. The sweet clover was taller now, green enough to look almost defiant against the pale soil beneath it. He did not see poison. He did not see safety either. He saw responsibility. The field had passed its first test. It could grow. The next test would be harder. Silas would have to cut it. And once the crop left the ground, every mistake would matter more. Silas read the notebooks differently after that. Before, he had searched them for proof. A sentence that said, sweet clover was safe. A sentence that said the county had been wrong. Walter had written neither. Instead, The pages were full of weather. Cut 6/14 clear. Turned 6/15. Heavy dew. Stacked 6/17. Good. Another year. Gut Schapte, doi. Rain. 7/3. Windrow heavy. 4 days. Heated and mow. Do not feed. Silas placed the two entries side by side. Same crop. Same field. Different result. He kept reading. Walter had recorded things Silas would once have dismissed as unnecessary detail. How late the dew stayed on the stems. Whether the windrows dried underneath. How warm the hay felt when stacked. Whether a bale smelled sweet. Sharp. Must-do. Oh, sua. One page contained nothing except a list of weather conditions for 7 consecutive days. Walter had circled 3. Dry wind. Low night dew. Good cure. Silas leaned back from the kitchen table. His father had not treated harvest as a single event. Cutting was only the beginning. What happened during the next several days mattered just as much as what had grown during the previous several months. That changed the way Silas looked at the western field. Until now. He had been thinking about yield. How much forage the 42 acres might produce. Whether the stand would survive the dry soil. Whether the neighbors would eventually admit it had been worth planting. Walter's notebook suggested those were not the dangerous questions. The dangerous question came later. Could Silas get it dry enough before storage? He turned to another page. A small diagram showed a haystack divided into 3 sections. Walter had marked the center, hot. Below it, open stack, sweet clover dark. Discarded center. Silas stopped. His father had thrown hay away. During a dry year, that told Silas more than any warning could have. Walter Mercer had been a man who saved bent nails in coffee cans. He reused baling wire, patched gloves, sharpened tools long after most men would have replaced them. For Walter to discard feed meant he had believed the risk was real. Silas closed the notebook. The lesson was becoming clearer. The old man had not been fearless. He had been selective about what he feared. The next morning, Silas went to the equipment shed and inspected the mower conditioner. Knives, belts, rollers, anything that could slow the cut or leave the crop uneven. Then he checked the rake. Then the baler. Roy drove past near noon and saw Silas working. He pulled into the yard. Getting ready already? Making sure everything works. Clover isn't ready yet. I know. Roy looked toward the western field. You worried about it? Yes. That answer surprised him. I thought you were the one telling everybody it wasn't poison. I never said that. Roy folded his arms. Silas wiped grease from his hands. I said the field isn't where I'm most worried. Roy glanced toward the machinery. So where are you worried? Silas pointed at the mower. After that touches it. He explained only part of what he had learned. Once the crop was cut, drying became critical. If weather turned against him and the hay stayed wet or spoiled, Silas would not pretend it was good feed simply because drought made forage valuable. Roy listened. You'd throw it away? If I don't trust it. In a bad year? Especially then. Roy shook his head. That's easy to say while the pasture's green. Silas knew he was right. By July, a questionable stack of hay might look very different if cattle were hungry and replacement feed cost twice as much. That was what made Walter's discarded stack so important. Knowledge mattered most when following it became expensive. That evening, Silas wrote his first entry in a new notebook. Westfield stand good. Harvest, not yet. Watch weather. Not tonnage. He paused, then added one more line. If it doesn't cure right, it doesn't become feed. Outside the window, the sweet clover moved beneath a clear sky. The field still looked like the controversial part of the experiment. Silas now knew better. The real test would begin the day he laid it down. The western field had been disappointing Silas for 14 years, not failing completely. That would have been easier. Failure made decisions simple. You stopped. The western field did something worse. It produced just enough to make Silas try again. The soil there changed within a few hundred yards, closer to the road. It was dark enough to hold decent grass. Farther west, the color faded, pale gray in places, almost white, along several low spots after a dry summer. Water moved strangely across it. Spring rain sometimes stood too long near the bottom. Then by July, the upper half could become hard enough to wring beneath a shovel. Silas had planted alfalfa there twice. The first stand looked promising. By the third year, thin patches opened, then more. The second seeding cost more and lasted less. He tried a grass mix afterward. It survived. That was not the same as producing. Every summer, Silas found himself asking the same question. How much more money should a bad field be allowed to consume before a farmer admitted it wanted something different? Walter's notebooks had answered that question decades earlier. Silas found the entry in February. West ground 2, alkaline in low part. Alfalfa thin. Sweet clover holds. He read it 3 times. Then found another page. Dry summer. Clover rooted deep. Better stand than expected. Nothing in the notebook called sweet clover magical. Walter had recorded failures too. Thin stands. Winter injury. Poor harvest timing. But the western field appeared repeatedly, and whenever it did, sweet clover seemed to tolerate conditions that had made other forage less reliable. Silas took a shovel there the next morning. The ground was partly frozen, but he managed to open several small holes after the sun softened the surface. He compared the high ground to the low. Texture, moisture, color. He did not pretend he could diagnose the entire field with his fingers, so he sent soil samples. When the results came back, they confirmed what years of weak stands had already suggested. The field was not uniform. Some sections were workable. Others were more difficult. Silas spread the report beside Walter's notebook. His father had not had laboratory numbers for every part. He had something else. Decades of crops telling him what the soil would tolerate. That was when Silas decided, not 42 acres, because he wanted to make a statement. 42 acres, because that was the part of the ranch where the old crop had the strongest reason to exist. Roy heard about the decision before planting. You're putting poison clover on your worst ground? Silas was loading seed bags. My most difficult ground. Same thing. No. Roy looked toward the western field. If that field won't hold alfalfa, what makes you think this will work? My father already tried it. When? Before either of us had gray hair. Roy laughed. And you're trusting that? I'm checking it. That was the distinction Silas cared about. He was not copying Walter blindly. He had looked at the field, read the notes, checked the soil, compared what had failed, then made a decision. The first rain after seeding came gently, enough to settle the soil without washing it. The stand emerged unevenly. The lower ground came first. The ridge followed later. There were gaps. Silas expected them. By early summer, however, the field looked more uniform than the alfalfa had in years. That was when people began paying attention. Not because they trusted the crop, because the bad field was suddenly producing something worth arguing about. Silas stood at the western fence one evening and looked across the clover. He thought about how many times he had blamed that ground. Too dry, too hard, too unreliable. Walter had never written that the field was bad. He had written what it was good at growing. That difference stayed with Silas. The first hidden lesson had nothing to do with poison. It was simpler. A difficult field was not always useless. Sometimes the crop was wrong before the field was. And if Walter had been right about that, Silas now had to find out whether he had also been right about the dangerous part. Harvest was getting closer. By the middle of June, the western field no longer looked like Silas's worst ground. That alone made people slow down when they drove past. The sweet clover had thickened across most of the 42 acres. Not perfectly. There were thinner patches on the upper ridge and a few bare spots where spring runoff had cut shallow lines through the soil. But the stand was good enough that Silas could no longer pretend nobody was watching. Roy stopped first. Then Mason Cole. Then a feed salesman Silas barely knew pulled over one afternoon and leaned against the fence for 10 minutes without saying much. The crop stood above Silas's knees now. Green stems. Heavy growth. Enough biomass that even Roy had stopped calling the field a failure. He had moved on to a different objection. You actually planning to bale all that? Silas looked across the stand. If the weather lets me? Roy shook his head. I still wouldn't feed it. You don't have to. That field looks better than my east hay ground. Silas glanced at him. That bothering you? A little. Silas smiled. That was the first time either of them laughed about the clover without the word poison entering the conversation. But Silas did not mistake curiosity for confidence. Neither did he mistake a thick stand for success. Every evening, he checked the crop. He looked at maturity, stem thickness, flowering, the amount of lower leaf still holding. He also watched the forecast harder than he watched the plants. That was new. When Silas had grown conventional hay, weather mattered. Of course it did. But Walter's notebooks had made weather feel less like inconvenience and more like part of the crop itself. A perfect cutting, followed by several wet days, was not a perfect cutting. It was a problem waiting to be stored. Silas began writing forecasts beside field notes. June 16, high humidity. June 17, chance of storm. June 19, clear. Wind. He checked 3 different forecasts and trusted none of them completely. Roy thought he was becoming obsessive. You've been watching that sky like it owes you money. Silas folded the weather sheet. It might. You usually cut by height. Usually. So what are you waiting for? A stretch, I trust. Roy looked at the field. You wait too long? Quality drops. I know. Cut too early. You leave yield. I know. You plan on knowing everything before you start? Silas looked at him. No. That's what it sounds like. Silas shook his head. I'm trying to know which mistake costs the most. That ended the argument. The field continued growing. By late June, several ranchers in the county had begun complaining about their first hay cutting. The spring had turned uneven. Rain came in brief events that helped one pasture and missed another. Some alfalfa fields were lighter than expected, nothing serious yet, just enough that people started paying more attention to Silas's 42 acres. Mason stopped by one afternoon. How many tons you think you've got standing there? Silas shrugged. Enough to cause trouble if I get it wrong. Mason laughed. You still talking about the poison thing? I'm talking about hay. It looks good. Right now. Mason pulled a stem from the fence line. So if the field is healthy, what are you worried about? Silas looked toward the barn. Everything that happens between here and there. That evening, he opened Walter's notebook again. One sentence stood out. Crop good. Weather bad. Waited. Next page lost some quality. Kept safe feed. Silas sat quietly. That was the trade-off nobody liked. Waiting could cost yield. Cutting could cost quality. Storing wrong could cost more than both. For decades, the county had simplified the lesson into one sentence. Sweet clover is dangerous. Walter had treated danger differently, not as a reason to avoid the crop, as a reason to control the process. Silas closed the notebook and walked outside. The western field moved in the evening wind, 42 acres of forage. Enough that Roy had stopped laughing. Enough that Mason had started asking about tonnage. Enough that Silas could imagine stacked bales beside the barn. But he did not feel victorious. Growing the crop had only proven that the field could support it. It had not proven Silas could harvest it well. The next morning, the 7-day forecast changed. Clear for 2 days. Then storms. Silas stared at the screen. The mower was ready. The crop was ready. The weather was almost ready. Almost was the problem. For the first time, Silas understood exactly why his father had written so much about the days after cutting. The dangerous part of the crop was no longer standing in the field. It was waiting for him to make a decision. Silas waited one more day. Roy thought that was a mistake. Mason thought it was ridiculous. By noon, both men had called. Crop's ready. I know. You've got 2 clear days. I know. Then cut it. Silas looked toward the western field from the kitchen window. The sweet clover was moving under a hot south wind. That wind was the only reason he was still considering it. Dry air. Good movement. Enough heat to help. But the forecast showed thunderstorms building on the 3rd afternoon. Not a certainty. Just enough risk to make every hour matter. Silas opened Walter's notebook. One entry from 1958 had been underlined twice. Cut before 3-day rain. Big windrow. Never dried underneath. Another. Lost quality. Waiting. Still better than stacking wet. Silas closed the book. That was the choice nobody liked. Wait too long, and the crop got older. cut too early. And the weather could trap moisture in the windrow. There was no perfect answer, only consequences. At 6 the next morning, Silas started the mower. The first pass felt almost ceremonial. For months, everyone had been watching the field as if the danger lived inside the green stems. Now the crop folded behind the machine in long rows. Sweet smell rose from the cut plants. Silas kept his speed slow. Uniform cutting mattered. A heavy pile beside a thin one dried unevenly. He watched every turn, every overlap, every place where the stand was thicker. By noon, he stopped. Only 26 acres were down. Roy drove up while Silas was checking a windrow. "That's it? For today? You've still got 16 acres standing." "I know. You've got a mower." "I know." Roy climbed out of the truck. "What are you doing?" Silas pulled apart the windrow with both hands. The top stems already felt lighter. The bottom was still cool, still carrying moisture. He held a handful toward Roy. "I can manage 26 acres before the storm better than 42. Roy stared at the standing field. "That's a lot of feed to leave." "It's not feed yet." The sentence irritated Roy. "It's high." "No." Silas dropped the stems. "It becomes hay when I can store it without regretting it." Roy shook his head. "Your father really scared you?" Silas looked at him. "No. He taught me where to be scared." By the second afternoon, the weather had become less cooperative. Humidity rose. The wind weakened. The cut clover dried on top, but stayed heavier underneath. Silas turned portions carefully. Not everything at once. He checked the lower stems repeatedly. Some sections were progressing, others were not. That evening, thunder appeared far west. Still distant, still uncertain. Mason stopped by. "You're going to get caught." "Maybe. You should bail tonight." Silas looked at the windrows. "No. They're close." "Close isn't dry." Mason laughed. "You plan on feeding moisture meters now?" Silas did not answer. He checked several sections again. The reading was inconsistent. That was enough. No bailing. At 2:40 the next afternoon, the storm arrived. Not a downpour. Worse, in some ways, a slow, steady rain. The kind that settled into everything. Silas stood inside the equipment shed and watched the cut field darken. 26 acres lay exposed. 16 still stood. Roy called. Silas let the phone ring twice before answering. "You should have cut it all." Roy said. Silas watched rain slide from the roof. "No. You're losing the hay either way." Not all of it. The standing 16 acres were still intact. The cut 26 had become a problem, but it was a problem Silas could evaluate. Not one he had multiplied. For the next 3 days, the weather stayed damp. The windrows changed color. Some dried again when the sun returned. Others remained heavy underneath. Silas walked every row, smelled them, opened them, checked for heating, checked for discoloration. He marked questionable sections with orange flags. Roy saw the flags on Friday. "What's that?" "Places I don't trust." "You gonna throw them away?" "If I have to." Roy stared at him. "In this drought?" Silas looked west. The pastures beyond the clover were already losing green. Rainfall had helped briefly, but not enough. Hay would become more valuable from this point forward. That made the decision harder, not easier. Silas picked up a handful from one flagged windrow. The smell had changed. Not rote. Not yet, but not right. He dropped it. Walter's notebook had prepared him for exactly this moment. Not when the field looked dangerous. When the forage looked almost usable. That was where mistakes became expensive. Silas looked at the 16 acres still standing, then at the 26 lying in front of him. The drought had finally arrived. And the first thing it demanded from him was not more hay. It was the discipline to refuse the wrong hay. The 16 acres Silas had not cut became the most criticized part of the ranch. Every time Roy drove past, he looked at them. Every time Mason stopped by, he asked the same question. "When are you going to finish that field?" Silas always gave the same answer. "When the weather earns it." By early July, that sounded almost insulting. The drought had deepened. Pastures farther west had already turned brown. Hay listings in town were disappearing faster than they appeared. What had been ordinary forage in May was beginning to feel like stored money. and Silas had 16 acres standing in the sun. Roy finally lost patience. "You've got feed right there." Silas was checking one of the orange-flagged windrows. "I've got a crop." "Same thing?" "No." Roy exhaled hard. Silas pulled apart the hay. The outer stems felt dry. The center still held more moisture than he liked. He had already separated several sections. Some would cure enough to bale. Some might not. That uncertainty was precisely why the 16 acres remained untouched. If he had cut the whole field before the storm, every acre would now be competing for the same drying weather. Instead, he still had one part of the crop standing clean, uncut, unweathered, uncommitted. Roy followed his eyes. "You really going to let it get older? If I have to, you'll lose quality." "I know. Maybe yield too." "I know." Roy shook his head. "Then what are you saving?" Silas looked at the standing clover. "Options." That word followed him for the next week. The first 26 acres became a sorting problem. Silas did not bale the entire field at once. He started with the driest sections, checked them repeatedly, baled only what had cured evenly enough for storage. The questionable rows stayed on the ground longer. Some improved, others did not. By the time he finished, the clean stack beside the barn was smaller than Roy expected. Much smaller. Roy counted the bales from the truck. "That's all?" "That's what I trust." "What about the rest?" Still deciding, Roy looked toward the field. "With hay prices going up?" Silas nodded. "That doesn't make bad hay better." 2 days later, the forecast finally changed. 4 clear days. Lower humidity. Wind from the northwest. Silas checked 3 different forecasts before starting the mower. Addam! He drove into the remaining 16 acres. This time, he cut the entire section. The crop had matured more than ideal. Stems were coarser. Some leaves had dropped. Silas knew he had sacrificed quality, but he had gained something else. A better curing window. That trade made sense now. He spread the windrows lighter than before, turned them only when needed, checked the underside, instead of trusting what the top looked like. Every afternoon, he recorded what he found. Top dry. Bottom cool. Wait. Next day better. Wind good. By the 3rd afternoon, the difference was obvious. The hay smelled cleaner. The color held better. The windrows dried more evenly. Silas did not celebrate. He simply kept checking. On the 4th day, he baled. Not everything. A low section near the edge had remained heavier. He left it out. Mason happened to be there. "You're leaving more?" Silas shut the tractor off. "Yes." Mason stared at the unbaled strip. "That's feed." "Maybe." "You're acting like every bale is dangerous." "No." Silas climbed down. "I'm acting like I don't know which bale becomes dangerous if I stop paying attention." That was the difference. Fear said, "Never grow sweet clover." Knowledge said, "Know when conditions have changed." By sunset, the second stack sat beside the first. 2 harvest windows. Same field. Same crop. Different handling. Silas stood between the stacks and looked back at the acreage. The field had given him less total hay than it might have in a perfect year. But perfect years were not what the county had anymore. The drought had made every bale valuable. That made discipline more important, not less. Roy arrived before dark. He looked at the clean stack. Then at the strip Silas had refused to bale. "You really left that?" "Yes." "Even now?" Silas nodded. Roy stared at him for several seconds, then said quietly, "You must know something I don't." Silas looked toward the barn. "No." He paused. "I just know what I'm not willing to guess about." The first part of the harvest was finished, but the most important bale had not appeared yet. That one would come from the hay. Silas almost trusted. The suspect bale looked almost normal. That was what bothered Silas most. It came from the first cutting, from a section near the center of the field where the windrow had stayed heavy after the rain. He had marked that strip with orange flags, left it longer, turned it twice, waited until the surface felt dry, then baled only the portion he thought had recovered. For 3 days, nothing seemed wrong. On the 4th morning, Silas walked past the stack and smelled it. Not rot. Not exactly. The sweet smell was still there. but underneath it was something heavier. Warm. Musty. Wrong. He stopped, pulled one bale from the edge. Then another. The outer twine was dry. The stems looked darker than the second cutting. Silas pushed his hand deep between the flakes. The center felt warm. Too warm. He pulled his hand back. Roy had arrived to borrow a hydraulic hose and found Silas standing beside the stack. "What's wrong?" Silas pointed. "That section heated." Roy pressed his hand into the bale. "Little warm. More than I want." Roy shrugged. "Hay heats?" "Sometimes." "You planning to tear the whole stack apart because one bale's warm?" Silas already was. He removed the outer bales one at a time. The deeper he went, the more uneven the hay became. Some smelled clean. Others were darker. One bale had a faint musty odor that stopped Silas immediately. He dragged it away from the others. Roy watched. "That one?" "Yes. Looks like feed to me." Silas cut the twine. The bale opened reluctantly. The outside was acceptable. The center was not. Darkened stems. Dampness trapped where the windrow had never cured evenly. Nothing dramatic. No black rot. No cloud of mold. Just enough difference that Silas no longer trusted it. Roy picked up a handful. "You're throwing this away?" "I'm not feeding it." "That wasn't my question." Silas looked at him. "It's the only answer that matters." Roy dropped the hay. By then, hay prices had climbed again. The drought had pulled pastures down across the county. Several ranchers were already feeding earlier than usual. Mason had bought a load from 90 miles away. Every bale beside Silas's barn now had a dollar value, large enough to make caution painful. That was exactly why Silas kept pulling the stack apart. He separated 8 bales, then 11, then 14. Some were probably fine. That word was the problem. Probably. Walter's notebook had a line Silas had read, so many times he could see it without opening the page. "When in doubt, do not make the cow prove you wrong." Roy stood with both hands on his hips. "You can't tell me every one of those is bad." "I'm not." "Then why separate them?" "Because I can't tell you everyone is good." Roy shook his head. "That's a lot of feed to lose." Silas looked toward the dry pasture beyond the barn. The cattle had already begun grazing shorter than he wanted. He knew exactly what those 14 bales represented. Days, maybe weeks. Money he might have to spend later. That made the decision hurt. It did not change it. That afternoon, Silas took samples from the questionable hay and set them aside for further checking. He kept the suspect stack physically separated from the clean bales. Different side of the shed. Different marking. No chance of mixing them by accident. When he fed later that week, he loaded only from the clean stack. Roy happened to be there again. "You really aren't touching those?" "No." "What if you run short?" Silas paused. "Then I buy feed." Roy stared at him. "At these prices?" "Yes." "That doesn't make any sense." Silas looked at the questionable bales. "It makes more sense than gambling with cattle." That night, he opened Walter's notebook. Near one of the old entries about spoiled sweet-clover hay, Walter had written, "Bad year makes bad hay tempting." Silas read the line twice. There it was. The real test. Not recognizing danger when feed was plentiful, recognizing it when every bale mattered. For months, the county had stared at Silas's field and called it poison. But standing clover had never been what Silas feared most. He feared the almost good bale, the one dry enough on the outside, dark only in the center, smelling just slightly wrong. The bale, a desperate rancher could talk himself into feeding. Silas closed the notebook. Outside, 14 bales sat apart from the rest. Same crop, same harvest, different decision. And for the first time, the thing everyone had been afraid of was no longer theoretical. Roy came back 2 mornings later. This time, he was not joking. Silas was standing beside the separated stack when Roy walked into the shed. "You get those bales checked?" "Enough to know I'm not feeding them." Roy looked at the 14 bales, then at the clean stack across the aisle. "Same field?" "Yes." "Same cutting?" "Same cutting." Roy frowned. "Then explain something to me." Silas waited. "If the clover is the problem, why are those bad and those good?" That was the question Silas had been waiting for all summer. Not because he wanted to win an argument, because Roy had finally asked about the difference instead of the plant. Silas took one of the suspect bales and cut the twine. The flakes opened. He pulled material from the center and laid it beside hay from a clean bale. From 5 feet away, the difference was easy to miss. Up close, it was not. The clean hay was lighter, drear. Its smell was sweet and sharp. The suspect material was darker and carried the faint mustiness Roy had noticed before. Silas pointed to it. This is where the story changes. Roy crossed his arms. Silas continued. Sweet clover contains a compound called coumarin. Roy raised an eyebrow. That the poison? No. Silas shook his head. That's what people keep getting wrong. He picked up the darker hay. When sweet clover hay spoils under the wrong conditions, certain molds can change that coumarin into something else. What? Dicumarol. Roy stared at him. Silas had practiced saying the word before explaining it to anyone. Not because the name mattered. The effect did. It interferes with the animal's ability to clot blood. Roy looked back at the bale. So that's why they bleed. That's why the old stories talk about bleeding. Silas dropped the hay. The cattle weren't imaginary. The danger wasn't imaginary. But the lesson got shortened. Roy was silent. Silas pointed toward the western field. People started saying the poison was growing out there. Then he pointed at the bale between them. But this is where the dangerous change can happen. Roy walked slowly toward the clean stack. So you can feed those? They're the hay I trust. That doesn't sound like yes. It isn't supposed to. Silas had learned enough to know that confidence was not the same as carelessness. He still watched storage, still checked bales, still paid attention to cattle. A plant having a known mechanism of risk did not give him permission to stop managing it. Roy pressed his hand into a clean bale. Dry. Cool. Your father knew all this? Not with these words. Silas picked up Walter's notebook from the workbench. He knew wet, spoiled sweet clover hay caused trouble. Silas opened one page. Cut dry. Good. Another. Rain. Heated. Do not feed. Walter had never written Dicumarol. He had written decisions. Roy read both entries, then looked toward the separated stack again. So everybody wasn't wrong. No. That old story was true. Part of it. Silas closed the notebook. They remembered the outcome. They lost the process. That afternoon, Mason came by. Roy was still there. Mason looked at the 2 stacks and laughed. You 2 sorting poison now? Roy answered before Silas could. Actually, yeah. Mason stopped smiling. Roy picked up hay from the suspect bale. This is the stuff he won't feed. Why? Roy looked at Silas. Tell him. Silas did. Shorter this time. Plant. Harvest. Moisture. Spoilage. The chemical change. Bleeding risk. Mason listened without interrupting. Then asked the same question Roy had. So why grow it at all? Silas looked through the open shed door toward the western field. Because that field could grow it. Because the drought had made forage scarce. Because difficult land sometimes needed a crop that fit it better. But none of that mattered unless he respected the point where usefulness could turn into danger. The crop has value, Silas said. So does knowing when not to feed it? Mason nodded slowly. For the first time, neither man called the western field poison. They looked at the bales instead. That was the change Silas had been trying to reach. Not convincing people there was no danger. Teaching them to put the danger in the right place. For 40 years, the county had feared the clover. Silas had learned to fear the spoiled bale. And that difference was about to matter more than anyone expected. The August. Nobody in the county was arguing about whether the drought was real. The ponds answered that. So did the pastures. Grass that normally carried cattle into late summer had stopped regrowing weeks earlier. Creeks narrowed. Dust gathered in wheel tracks. Hay ads disappeared almost as soon as they were posted. Silas began feeding earlier than he wanted. Not heavily. Just enough to slow the pressure on his remaining pasture. The clean, sweet clover hay became part of that ration. He introduced it carefully, watched the cattle, checked every stack before loading. The 14 suspect bales remained separated under the shed roof. Untouched. Roy noticed. You're actually feeding the good stack now? Yes. How are they doing? Silas looked toward the cows. Like cattle in a drought. Roy waited. That means? They're holding. No miracle. No sudden weight gain. No storybook transformation. The cows were working harder for less. Some showed more rib than they had in June. But they were functional. Their condition was manageable. And Silas still had feed he trusted. That alone was becoming unusual. Roy had started buying hay from 2 counties away. Mason had already sold part of his herd. Another rancher down the road had begun hauling cattle to a pasture 90 miles north. Nobody was stupid. Everyone was reacting to the same shortage. The difference was timing. Silas had put forage into storage before everyone began chasing the same bales. And he had refused to increase the quantity by pretending questionable hay was safe. One afternoon, Roy walked into the shed and looked at the clean stack. How much you got left? Enough to matter. Roy stared at the bales. I'd pay you for 20. Silas looked at him. For your cows? Yes. Silas did not answer immediately. 3 months earlier, Roy had wanted the field plowed under. Now he wanted the harvest. That should have felt satisfying. It didn't. Roy wasn't wrong then to fear bad sweet-clover hay, and he wasn't desperate now because he had managed poorly. The drought had compressed everyone's choices. Silas understood that too well to gloat. He walked to the clean stack and counted slowly, then looked toward the pasture. I can spare 12. Roy nodded immediately. I'll take them. Silas held up a hand. Only from this stack. Roy glanced toward the separated bales. I know. No mixing. I know. Silas stepped closer. And if anything smells wrong when you open one, don't feed it because you paid for it. Roy looked at him. You really think I'd do that? Silas gave him a tired smile. I think drought makes men negotiate with themselves. Roy looked at the 14 suspect bales. That line landed harder than Silas intended. They loaded the 12 clean bales together. Each one Roy took made the stack visibly smaller. Silas felt every gap. He was giving away feed in a year when feed was becoming difficult to replace. But Roy needed it more urgently. And Silas still had enough margin to make the choice. That was what surprised him most. The sweet-clover had not saved the ranch. The harvest decisions had not stopped drought. What they had done was preserve options. Later that week, Mason arrived. He did not ask whether Silas was still growing poison. He asked, How'd you get yours cured? Silas looked at him. That question meant more than an apology ever could. They walked the western field. Silas showed him where the first cutting had lain through rain, where he had stopped mowing, where the second section had waited for a better weather window, where the questionable strip had been left behind. Mason listened. So you took less hay? Yes. To make better hay. Silas nodded. Better isn't always more. Mason looked across the drought-brown field. That sentence would have sounded foolish in June. In August? It sounded expensive. And true. That evening, Silas opened Walter's notebook. He found the old sentence again. Bad year makes bad hay. Tempting. Below it, Silas wrote his own line. Good year rewards tonnage. Bad year rewards judgment. Then he closed the book. Outside, the clean stack was smaller. The suspect stack was exactly the same. That was how Silas knew he had not confused scarcity with permission. And for the first time, the county was beginning to understand why that mattered. By late August, the western field was no longer the strangest thing on Silas Mercer's ranch. The strange thing was the traffic. Pickup trucks began turning into his yard every few days. Some belonged to ranchers, Silas knew well. Others came from farther out. They had all heard the same thing. Mercer had not much, but usable hay, and in a drought. That was enough to make people curious. The first man to ask directly was Eli Parker. He stood beside the barn and looked at the clean stack. You selling any? Some? What kind? Sweet-clover. Eli's face tightened. For 1 second, the old reaction returned. Then he looked at Silas. The same stuff everybody's been talking about? Yes. Eli stared at the bales. My grandfather wouldn't let that hay on the place. Silas nodded. Mine threw some away. That answer confused him. Silas walked him to the separated stack. 14 suspect bales still sat apart from everything else. They had become a kind of silent lesson. Eli pointed. What's wrong with those? I don't trust them. You test every bale? No. Then how do you know? I don't know enough. Silas let the sentence sit. That's why they're not feed. Eli looked back at the clean stack. So these are safe? Silas shook his head slightly. They're the ones I put up under better conditions and kept separate from the questionable hay. That's what I can tell you. He refused to promise more than he knew. That mattered. The drought had made people hungry for certainty. Silas had learned not to sell certainty where only management existed. Eli bought 8 bales. Before loading them, Silas repeated the same instruction he had given Roy. If one opens wrong, smells wrong, or looks spoiled, don't argue with it. Eli nodded. You always this cheerful when you sell hay? Only poison hay. Eli laughed. That joke would have been impossible 2 months earlier. By September, the questions changed. At first, people asked, how much do you have? Then, what did you plant? Then finally, how did you put it up? That was the question Silas cared about. Mason came back with a notebook of his own. Roy brought his brother-in-law. 3 ranchers stood in the equipment shed while Silas showed them the 2 stacks. He did not give them a lecture. He showed them differences. The clean hay, the darker suspect material, where the first cutting had been caught by rain, why he stopped after 26 acres, why 16 stayed standing until the next weather window. Mason looked at the separated bales. You could have had more hay if you'd cut everything that first day. Yes. Probably a lot more. Yes. Roy answered before Silas could. And probably more of this. He pointed at the suspect stack. That was the moment Silas noticed the real reversal. Roy was explaining it now. Not perfectly, but correctly. The county had spent decades treating the crop itself as the warning. Now men were talking about harvest conditions. Moisture. Spoilage. Storage. The crop had not changed. The conversation had. A week later, a cattleman named Frank Dorsey arrived, looking for 10 bales. Silas only had 6. He was willing to sell. Frank glanced at the suspect stack. What about those? No. I'll pay the same. No? More. Silas looked at him. They're not for sale as cattle feed. Frank frowned. I'm short. So am I. That hay could get me another week. Silas nodded. It could. Frank stared at him. Silas did not move. For months. This had been the point Walter's notebook was preparing him for, not identifying bad hay when there was plenty of good hay available. Refusing it, when someone was desperate enough to offer money, Frank finally looked away. I'll take the 6. They loaded them. After the truck left, Roy stood beside the empty space in the stack. You could have sold him all 14. I know. At that price? I know. Roy smiled faintly. Guess the poison finally made you money. Silas looked at the suspect bales. No. He shook his head, knowing what not to sell did. That evening, he walked the western field alone. The drought had taken most of the green out of it. The soil showed through in places. There was nothing dramatic left. No lush crop, no harvest waiting to save anyone. Just stubble, dry stems, and a field that had already done its work. Silas looked toward the barn. Months earlier, men had wanted that field plowed under. Now they wanted the hay. But that was not the part Walter would have cared about. The important change was simpler. They no longer asked whether sweet clover was poison. They asked when it became dangerous. And once people started asking the right question, fear had finally turned into knowledge. The first real rain came in October. Not enough to end the drought, not enough to refill the ponds, but enough to turn the dust dark and make the ranch smell alive again. Silas stood beneath the barn roof and watched water strike the yard. Across the road, the western field disappeared behind a gray curtain. 5 months earlier, that field had been the center of every argument. Poison, bleeding clover. A crop no sensible cattleman should grow. Now there was almost nothing left to argue about. The hay had been cut. Most of the clean bales had been fed or sold. The cattle were still standing, and the 14 suspect bales remained exactly where Silas had placed them. Separate. Untouched. Roy came over 2 days after the rain. He found Silas inside the shed with Walter's notebook open on the workbench. You keeping those things forever? Roy pointed toward the suspect stack. Silas smiled. Long enough to remember why they're there. Beside the stack sat one clean bale Silas had deliberately kept back. Roy looked from one to the other. Same field. Yes. Summit plant. Yes. Roy shook his head. That's the part that gets me. Silas cut the twine on both. The clean bale opened in dry flakes. The other showed darker material toward the center. Silas placed a handful from each on the workbench. Months earlier, Roy would have looked across 42 acres and called everything growing there poison. Now the difference fit between his two hands. The field never told you which one you'd end up with. Roy said. Silas nodded. That happened after cutting. They stood quietly. That was the entire lesson. Not that sweet clover was harmless. It wasn't. Not that every ranch should plant it. They shouldn't. Not that Silas had discovered some forgotten crop capable of defeating drought. He hadn't. The drought had still cost him pasture. It had still forced him to feed early. It had still made every lost bale painful. What the field gave Silas was another forage option on difficult ground. What Walter's notes gave him was something more valuable, a reason not to confuse a useful crop with careless handling. Later that month, Mason asked whether Silas would plant the western field again. Silas did not answer immediately. Maybe. Mason looked surprised. After all this? That's why. You proved it works. No. Silas shook his head. I proved I can use it under some conditions. There was a difference. The next year might bring different weather, a different curing window, a different field problem. Knowledge did not remove uncertainty. It told him what to watch when uncertainty arrived. Before winter, Silas copied Walter's most important entries into his own notebook. Then he added what the summer had taught him. West field sweet clover held. First cutting caught rain. Suspect hay separated. Do not let shortage change the rule. He stopped there, then wrote one final sentence. The crop is only half the job. Silas closed the notebook. Walter's old book sat beside it. For decades, father and son had disagreed without realizing they were asking different questions. Young Silas had asked, "Can this plant hurt cattle?" Walter had asked, "Under what conditions does the danger appear?" The first question produced fear. The second produced management. That difference had taken Silas 44 years to understand before shutting the barn for the night. He carried the clean bale outside. Then he looked back at the suspect stack. Same seed. Same soil. Same summer. Different outcome. The county had spent 40 years staring at the field. Silas finally understood why his father had kept writing about rain. Windrows. Heat. Smell. And storage. The field was never the final test. The real test began the moment the mower touched it, and the old farmer's greatest lesson was not knowing what to grow. It was knowing what not to feed.